Guys, it's fight week. I'm recording this Monday evening. Brook versus Galahad will be hitting our screens live on Sky Sports pay-per-view Saturday night. It's exciting times. I must admit, despite the fact that I think the fight is one-sided, despite the fact it's not a natural fight I'd have looked to make, I am starting to get more and more hype for this fight. As conversation and discussion around it is building, I'm more and more looking forward to seeing what actually goes down on the night of the fight. The purpose of this video is to discuss the undercard. Now, we'll get into the undercard nitty-gritty in the podcast that we did this week. But a lot of people have been asking the question, is this a good undercard? Is this not a good undercard? So I wanted to talk through it in brief, mention some of the fights that have been made, because it's very possible some of the fights that have been made you won't actually be aware of. I must admit, I wasn't aware of them until I actually looked them up. And I want to really come to an assessment as to whether or not this is a good undercard. So let's look at it. I believe so far there are 10 fights scheduled. So we'll start from the bottom up. And the bottom fight listed on BoxRec, Benn, who's 3-0, is fighting an opponent whose name I won't try and pronounce. The opponent has had 12 fights, and of those 12, he's lost 10 of them. So that looks like a fairly routine fight for Benn. At this stage of his career, Benn appears to be being used as a 4-round fighter before the main event, trying to generate hype and interest in his career against opponents who are somewhat overmatched. And I expect that trend to continue in this particular fight. Paul Smith fighting TBA. Paul Smith is one of these fighters who is actually a decent fighter if he's in a main event or in a big fight. But he's one of these fighters who seems terrible to watch on 8-rounders on undercards. Martin Murray is another one. And for me, Paul Smith raises his game dependent on the level of the opponent, and he has a habit of really labouring unnecessarily to victory when he's fighting on undercards. So the fact that he's fighting someone who, even this close to the fight, hasn't been announced, doesn't overly inspire confidence that that is particularly going to be an entertaining fight. Craig Richards, 4-0, is fighting an opponent who's had 12 fights, of which he's only won 4 of them. So, again, boxing isn't a sport fought on paper, but you would assume that would be a relatively routine victory. Galahad, 19-0, is fighting an opponent with a losing record. Indeed, a guy who has lost 23 times. Now, I appreciate Kid Galahad is somewhat on the comeback trail. Yeah, that's not a great fight. Gavin McDonnell, who hypothetically seems to be moving towards a world title shot. Undefeated Gavin McDonnell is fighting a fighter who's only had 8 fights, and he's lost 2 of those 8 fights. And that really makes up the bottom half of the undercard. So certainly in terms of those fights, you wouldn't see any upsets there. You wouldn't see any tight competitive fights. Those should be one-sided fights. And none of those are particularly fighters who I am overly excited to see in a routine run-out. I guess Benn would be the slight exception there. He's very much at the start of his career. He's only 3-0. He's an exciting name, an exciting talent, and I guess it's probably the nature of that kind of fight you'd expect to see him in at this stage, and he's got a big enough hype around him to still be interested in watching him against an opponent who's 2-10. Let's now talk about the top half of the undercard. Martin Joseph Ward, who's undefeated, fights Andy Townend, who's 16-3 for the British title. Callum Smith, who's undefeated, fights an opponent who is 21-3. This opponent, I think he's the top super middleweight in Hungary. I think BoxRec have him 70th globally. He hadn't beaten anyone who I'd actually recognised in terms of their name. And then on the top of the bill, you've got the 3 world title fights. Casimero versus Charlie Edwards and Haskins versus Hall. Now, we may talk about those fights in a little bit more detail in this video in just a second. But before we do, as for that undercard, it's not one for me that gets me hugely excited. But let me give a quick disclaimer first. I would describe myself as a hardcore boxing fan. I watch all the fights fundamentally, I'm a guy who sits here and spends his evening recording videos for a YouTube boxing channel. I guess that is the sign of being a hardcore fan. However, I am the kind of fan who gets more into boxing when there's hype around the fight, when the boxers are particularly well known. You know, I would rather see a fight with bad blood and with a lot of smack talk as opposed to, I don't know, two 8-0 prospects I haven't heard of fighting in a 50-50 fight. Yeah, maybe that means I'm not as hardcore a fan as some of you out there, but I am someone who gets excited by the build-up and gets excited by the hype of an occasion. And fundamentally, I believe that is representative of most boxing fans out there, because you only have to look at my channel and see that if you're doing a video on a fight where there's a huge amount of bad blood, the views are twice as high as a fight where there's no bad blood. You know, that sort of stuff generates interest. So here what we have is a collection of nice guys: Lee Haskins, Stuart Hall, Martin Ward, Callum Smith, Charlie Edwards, Gavin McDonnell. You know, a collection of nice guys in fights that haven't really generated a huge amount of buzz on them. Now, Haskins versus Stuart Hall, I view that as an 80-20 matchup. Casimero versus Charlie Edwards, I do view that as a 50-50 matchup. Anything else on the card? Actually, no. Martin Ward versus Andy Townend. I'm not going to pretend to be experts on either guy's career, but I understand that's a tighter matchup as well. But taking those ones out of it, the rest of the fights are not competitive. They're 95-5 chances. I mean, would you give the guy Callum Smith's in with, Norbert Nemes-Apati, any more than a 5% chance? Would you give the guy Gavin McDonnell's in with, who's had 8 fights and lost 2 of them, any more than a 5% chance? Would you give TBA fighting Paul Smith any more than a 5% chance? You know, would you think the guy who's fighting Conor Benn with a 2-10 record has any more than a 5% chance? You know, not only are they not competitive fights, but they're not fights where there's the hype generated. You know, George Grove versus Martin Murray on the last undercard. Spike O'Sullivan versus Chris Eubank Jr. I never viewed either of those as competitive matchups, but there was hype around them, there was talk around them, and for me that got me interested. So for me, I think this undercard lacks 1, hype, and 2, lacks star power. You know, often on these undercards you have a Chris Eubank Jr. or a George Grove, something of that nature, and even though, or even a Dillian White, for example, and even though they're not in the most enthralling fights in terms of how competitive they are, that star power, that name recognition they have really helps to drive interest to the card, especially when there's a lot of talk beforehand. You know, Chris Eubank Jr. versus Spike, that turned into a big hype fight. Even Murray versus Groves, you know, they had the gloves are off. I'm trying to think recently, Dave Allen versus Dillian White, that was a fight that got me very excited with all the talk beforehand. And I think this undercard lacks that. I think it lacks the bad blood. I think it lacks the hype. Obviously, the main event is an event that is, whatever you think about it, has generated a huge amount of interest. So Eddie Hearn could say, because the main event is so strong and features such a big fight, there's less need to have a strong undercard. But for me, I am someone who likes to sit down and watch every fight and spend the whole evening in front of the TV when there's a big boxing event. And whilst I will do this for this card, you know, it's one of those, I could see myself checking Twitter and playing around on Facebook for the entire time Paul Smith is in the ring, or the entire time Gavin McDonnell's in the ring, certainly. Let's give a minute, and as I say, we'll cover them in more detail on the podcast, but let's give a minute to each of the 2 world title fights. Lee Haskins versus Stuart Hall. Obviously this is a rematch. Haskins won the first fight with a semi-comfortable points decision. Stuart Hall, he's a respectable fighter, big guy for the weight, strong guy, tough guy. He produced a superhuman, once-in-a-career performance to beat Malinga when he won the world title. Fundamentally, some fighters seem to have it in them to produce one career-defining performance. You know, we've seen it a few times. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. Perhaps Darren Barker versus Daniel Gill. You know, Barker probably sub-elite in terms of my estimations, but went over, put on a career-defining performance. I'm trying to think of another example. Perhaps Paul Smith in the first fight against Arthur Abraham, even though he lost on the cards. That was a performance well and above anything we've ever seen from Paul Smith before. And, I think Stuart Hall did that against Malinga. But I think fundamentally Hall is a bit crude. We saw that in the Paul Butler fight. The guy can be outboxed, outslicked, outskilled. And I think Lee Haskins has the potential to do that. Haskins is no world beater, don't get me wrong, but I think he's got the beating of Stuart Hall again in this rematch. I think skills will pay the bills here, and I see Haskins coming through. Casimero versus Charlie Edwards, it's an enthralling matchup because of the story, not because of the personalities, not necessarily because of the styles. You've got Charlie Edwards, highly touted amateur, undefeated, taking on a world title fight in only his 9th fight. I actually think it's clever matchmaking for Eddie Hearn. With this guy being a super, what weight class is it? I think he's a flyweight. With it being a flyweight fight, there isn't going to be too many big paydays for Charlie Edwards. But this kind of fight will gain huge exposure on a big platform. It will get his name further out there, and it will potentially make fights in future with the likes of Andrew Selby and maybe Calify and those type of guys more viable. His name's going to be out there more. It's going to generate a bit more hype around his career, win, lose or draw. So I can understand why Eddie Hearn's doing this, because otherwise the earning potential, both for Edwards and for Hearn, just isn't there. The opponent, Casimero, by all accounts, no world beater. I'm not going to lie and say that I've spent a huge amount of time researching his back catalogue, but not a world beater. The suggestion here is that this could be a tight fight where the slight edge in technical ability goes to Charlie Edwards, whereas maybe the edge in terms of power, experience and grit goes to the defending title Casimero. It's one of those where how it breaks down tactically could be key. If Edwards can keep his distance, box, be smart, pick his work, land the cleaner shots, he could well establish an early advantage here. If Casimero is able to drag him into a dogfight, get the fight up close and have a bit of a fight, have a bit of a scrap, then Charlie Edwards could be in deep water at this stage of his career. Interesting fight, and one that will do wonders for Charlie Edwards' profile regardless of the result. Could potentially be the most competitive fight on the card as far as I'm concerned, that particular one. So that's my thoughts all in all. Just wanted to touch on each of the fights on the bill and give you some perspective of who's fighting and what my thoughts are. I guess to summarise, 3 world title fights on a bill is always good. The lack of personality, the lack of hype, the lack of bad blood, the lack of celebrity in terms of the top fights other than Brook Golovkin lead me to say that, if I'm honest, my gut instinct is a slightly disappointing undercard from my perspective. Eddie Hearn is probably correct if he's banking on the fact that the main event will be such a draw. He didn't need to pull out the undercard for people to buy the pay-per-view, and to be fair, I will buy the pay-per-view. Regardless of the undercard, I'll just be a little bit disappointed about it. Some of the lower undercard fights, we'll have to see which ones get televised. Gavin McDonnell, Paul Smith, those sort of guys could potentially be hard viewing. Let me know your thoughts, people. What's your take on this undercard? Am I being a bit harsh? We do, after all, have 3 world title fights. What do you think has got the potential to be the best undercard fight of the night? Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your take on this. If you've enjoyed the video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. And if you want to hear more, check out the podcast, which we will do live Wednesday at 8:30 on this channel. Where we'll discuss the card and we'll go through the card and get into it in full detail and have 4 or 5 people giving their predictions. Let me know your thoughts, people. Many thanks indeed for watching. As always, I do appreciate it.